people were doing, pitching their tents in Harvard Yard. I mean, I said, have you any idea this is the most liberal institution in the world apart from maybe Berkeley? Why are you occupying Harvard? It can't be Larry Summers. The Occupy movement was, as that illustrates, tremendously incoherent, almost completely incapable of articulating its program. And that, of course, is why it's achieved nothing. But it wasn't entirely wrong, because there's no question that a remarkable widening of the income gap, of income distribution, occurred from the late 1970s until now. And this is there if you look at almost any serious measure. Median household incomes in the United States stagnated and even fell. In real terms, the 1% did staggeringly better than everybody else. The 0.01% did staggeringly better than everybody else in the 1%. It's a remarkable phenomenon. But what are we to make of it? What explains it? What caused it? About this, there is much, much less clarity, and that, I think, was the problem that Occupy Wall Street had. It was not, to my mind, credible to blame this widening of the income gap on Goldman Sachs or any other institution headquartered in and around Wall Street. It wasn't remotely credible when Jeff Sachs stood up in Zuccotti Park and gave his deranged speech denouncing the 1% for their criminal doings, because that really doesn't explain the widening of the income distribution. Even though there clearly were some criminal doings, that's not the reason that income distribution has become less equal. Part of the reason is globalization, something Sachs himself knows full well. But globalization increases inequality not only because it increases the returns on certain kinds of capital, particularly on certain kinds of education, but crucially, it reduces the returns on unskilled labor in the West. I think a far better guide to this problem than Sachs is my friend Charles Murray, whose book Coming Apart focuses not on the antics of the 1%, but mainly on the disintegration of the bottom 20%. And this disintegration of the American working class is a really, really powerful and alarming story. The breakdown of social cohesion, the breakdown of the family, the breakdown of occupation, the decline of educational standards. These things together have taken what was once the bedrock of US society and wrecked it. And the cognitive elite, as Murray calls them, the people who go to Harvard and live in zip codes like the one I live in, 02138, we don't see those people. We do not see them. So there is a very real disintegration that's happened. But its causes, I don't think, are well understood. And it's quite wrong, and indeed, I think, disingenuous, to blame it on Wall Street, or for that matter, on Harvard. It's really what's gone wrong at the bottom end of the social scale that is the key. Now, Charles Murray argues in the book, though it's not made entirely explicit, that he thinks the key is the way in which social programs enacted in the 60s and subsequently eroded the cohesion of working class life, particularly the family, and reduced incentives to work, reduced incentives to study, increased incentives to screw around and bum around. That's the alternative hypothesis. If you believe Jeff Sachs, what we need is for the federal government to play an even bigger role and increase its influence on social life. If you believe Charles Murray, you think the federal government's actually been the cause of much of this social disintegration. I'm with Murray in this argument, but it's a very difficult argument to make. It's a very, very hard thing to show that the disintegration at the lower end of the social scale is mainly a result of government programs. Right now, for me, that's a hypothesis, not one that's completely founded.
I have just two more questions here, and I think we've got one from the audience with sorry, do we have Hamish? Okay.
I'm interested in the idea of a seventh app, and I agree with you entirely on institutions. And one of the, I think, the more interesting books of the last 20 years is Victor Davis Hanson's Carnage and Culture, which is really about the institutions that allowed the West to have military supremacy. And of course, as an economic historian, I suppose you believe that there's a certain economic inevitability to the rise of the West. But I'd like you to comment on Hanson's ideas that the Western way of war, which comes from, in some ways, things like property rights and dissent and democracy, which influence the way Western armies have typically fought, how that has had an impact or an explanatory power in the rise of the last 500 years.
Well, thank you. I'll never show any disrespect for a fellow of the Hoover Institution. So all praises to Victor for his work. I'm not the kind of historian who thinks that everything's economically determined. Least of all outcomes in war, which often go against the economic grain. After all, if economics determined wars, the US wouldn't have had much trouble defeating North Vietnam, would it? The key, I think, to understanding why the Western way of war became so successful does not lie quite where he locates it. I tell the story, and if you've read the book, you'll know this, but I think it's a great story, of Benjamin Robbins. Benjamin Robbins was a self-taught mathematician and physicist who dreamt of emulating Isaac Newton. And he did. He ended up being elected to the Royal Society. He wasn't in any way a man of means. He, in fact, made his living as an engineer, civil engineer for the British East India Company. And it was while he was doing that work that he applied Newtonian physics to ballistics. And Robbins's book, New Principles of Gunnery, was a revolution in military affairs almost without parallel. There's a guy at this table who's going like this, clutching his brow, thinking, can I look at my BlackBerry? Will he notice? I just want to make this fun. So, before we all clutch our brows and reach for our soon-to-be obsolete Canadian BlackBerries. Sorry, couldn't resist it. Let me tell you about Benjamin Robbins' great discovery. His great discovery, sir, was that if you apply Newtonian principles to the trajectory of a projectile fired from a rifled barrel, adjust for wind resistance, it hits the target quite often. From the moment that Robbins' New Principles of Gunnery was published, immediately was translated into all other European languages, European artillery became accurate. Nobody else had that. Even on the eve of the First World War, the Turks were still trying to defend the straits of the Black Sea with essentially medieval cannons. That, more than anything else, explains why, from the mid-18th century until the 20th century, Western armies usually won. Because most war is about artillery. From about that point, that's what it's about. The First World War is not decided by bayonets. It's a war of artillery between two very heavily armed modern Western forces. So my take on this is that military power primarily is a function of scientific and technological innovation. And everything else, courage, discipline, all of that is for the birds. If you've got the accurate artillery, then you'll likely win. And if you track US military history, it's essentially the history of ever more accurate projectiles. We've now reached the point where the precision is so astonishing that we can use missile technology remotely to kill specific individuals from an amazingly long range. All we need to know is the address. That's the kind of military power that really counts. And that's why the Chinese ability to close the gap in the area of cyberspace is the thing that should most worry the Pentagon. especially since, incredibly, some of the hardware ended up being outsourced to China to be built. If you think that stuff came back clean, you don't know China.
I'm going to just wrap things up. I think, Mitch, you had one last question while I get a few things organized here.
Yeah, I'm going to ask the question, not make a speech. In your 6 apps, you mentioned the rule of law. But one of the ones you don't mention, I just wonder about, is a free and open society, and whether or not the Western free and open societies have led to dominance and the fact that China has not yet developed a free and open society.
I spent a lot of time talking about that question of how freedom exactly fits into the argument as I was, I suppose, revising the final draft of the book. And I realized that what I was really arguing was that the institutions that I'm describing were institutions that upheld in various ways freedom. It's often a mistake to declare human rights. It's often an illusion of our Western civilization that if you just list the rights that people have, magically they'll have them. What really creates freedom are secure institutional frameworks within which it can flourish. The economic freedom that is central to competition, the intellectual freedom that is central to successful scientific inquiry, and so forth. The freedom to dispose over our property that was so central to Locke's thinking. So I think really what Civilization is about as a book is the mainsprings, the frameworks within which freedom can flourish. I don't have any desire to backdate human rights, democracy, feminism, gay rights, or any of the recent freedoms that we've discovered. They're all of very recent provenance, some as recent as the 1960s. And they can't therefore have any explanatory value if we're trying to explain the rise of the West. Even, dare I say it, freedom of speech was highly circumscribed in most Western societies until very recently. Just ask Oscar Wilde. Think of all the things that were still restricted, banned from publication in England. Think of Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover. No, the freedom of expression, like so many of the freedoms we enjoy today, is the kind of luxury you can afford once you've got the real killer apps to work, once you've established the real foundations of freedom. And in that sense, this is a not entirely comfortable history. It's not entirely what liberals want to hear about the past. And that's one of the reasons I'm rather fond of the book. I hope it's in some measure upsetting to readers of a more liberal persuasion and encouraging to those of a more conservative persuasion. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.